Welcome everyone to this year's Jacobson Family Sustainable Impact Lecture Series. My name is Christina Fialho and I'm going to be your moderator today. I'll just share a little bit about myself. I'm an attorney and the managing director of the Brittingham Social Enterprise Lab, which is a center here at USC Marshall that is really educating and empowering the next generation of social entrepreneurs and social impact leaders. And prior to joining the lab, I co-founded and directed a national nonprofit in the field of immigration detention for about a decade, where I actually had the pleasure of meeting two of the panelists who are here with me today. So Lauren Grattan, who is the co-founder and chief community officer at Mission Driven Finance, and Mark Hanis, who is the co-founder of two social enterprises, Inclusive America and Progressive Shopper. So Lauren's organization, Mission Driven Finance, is an impact investment firm and certified B Corporation that develops strategies to close financial gaps in order to close opportunity gaps. And I actually had the pleasure of working with Lauren and her team to build $1 million impact investment fund to secure the release of people from immigration detention. Lauren also has served on the steering committee of Inclusive Capital Collective at Zebras Unite and on the board of Business for Good San Diego. She's also a 2019 social venture Circle Innovation Entrepreneur. And I met Mark through Echoing Green's fellowship program back when I became a fellow in 2012, and he was the founder and leader of the Genocide Intervention Network. And since then, Mark has helped found several social impact organizations, the Beek Center for Social Impact and Innovation at Georgetown University, the Oregon Alliance, also United to End Genocide, before starting these two organizations that he's currently leading. Mark really brings a wealth of international experience. He's currently living in Europe, so he's calling in very late there. I think it's 9 p.m., so thank you for joining us, Mark. And he's also served as a White House Fellow in the office of then Vice President Joe Biden as the National Security Affairs Special Advisor for South America and Africa. I'd also like to welcome our third panelist here today, Misha Kouzeh, who I've had the pleasure of recently meeting as she is a Doctor of Education candidate here at USC. Misha also is a distinguished lecturer at UCLA with expertise in ESG, social impact, and sustainability across 3 continents. She's worked with organizations such as Coca-Cola, Unilever, also the UN World Health Organization, as well as the first ever sustainability centers at Cal State universities. And with these amazing panelists today, we're going to be talking about engaging communities as an ESG pillar, a look at worldwide trends. So this is actually the second panel discussion in our series this year, which the theme of this year's series is how businesses are centering community and social impact. And I want to take a moment to thank the Jacobson family for endowing this annual series, as well as my team here at the Brittingham Social Enterprise Lab, especially Michelle Duong, who's our operations coordinator, and Avni Shah, our communication strategist, for helping to make today possible. So if you are an audience member and you have any questions during this session, please feel free to put them in the chat box below at the bottom of the screen, and we'll be organizing them so I can pose them to our panelists toward the end of the hour. We'll also have a few folks being able to answer some questions during the session, so feel free to drop in any questions or thoughts that you have in the chat. I can see it's already kind of lively, so that's great. Okay, so what's all the buzz about ESG? So ESG, which stands for environmental, social, and governance considerations, are increasingly integral part of risk and ethics assessments used by companies, investors, other stakeholders. And as part of last year's Jacobson Family Sustainable Impact Lecture Series, we offered a panel discussion on what social innovators need to know about ESG reporting and risk from the viewpoint of corporate leaders in the ESG space. So we had amazing esteemed panelists such as Paula Loop of PwC and Joe Allenson of Salesforce. But today we kind of really wanted to shift that lens and begin to ask similar questions, but to our community leaders. So I wanted to get started first with a question for you, Misha. You and I have talked a lot about how we're in the middle of a paradigm shift in corporate America. And the companies that, really are going to be coming out ahead are the ones truly embedding social impact goals into the core of their business model and corporate strategy. So I'd love if you could share some of the important current trends that are shaping the ESG landscape domestically as well as internationally.
Thank you so much, Christina, for having me. It's an honor to be here with, my amazing panelists. So we're really seeing a lot of different trends. I would say there are 5 major trends we've seen over the past year. We definitely see ESG shifting from risk management to a value driver. I would say that France and Europe in general are usually at the forefront of ESG regulation, really taking steps that go far beyond just mere reporting requirements. So that's very, very exciting to see. The second trend I would share is that there's been a big backlash against greenwashing. So it's not only led to increased regulation, we're also seeing more voluntary certification happening, more specifically the B Corp certification done by the nonprofit B Lab. We're seeing over 4,000 certified B corporations in more than 70 countries around the world and over 150 industries. And one of the exciting things I do as I teach on ESG to international partners is I'm seeing a shift even in South Korea. So South Korea experienced quite some pressure from fund managers to drastically cut carbon emissions, specifically for the big top 10 companies there, including Samsung. So what we saw is that South Korea is now embracing these ESG standards. We see that 9 out of 10 companies now have a separate ESG division. So we're definitely on our way to combat climate change that way, if you will. The third trend that we're seeing is that consumer and employee activism is on the increase. So we see that 84% of employees say they base their buying or even their career decisions on ESG credentials. So it's really starting from the ground up, from the communities, right, we're serving and consumers. The fourth trend I would say is very connected to our discussion today. It's that climate change is a social issue and not just an environmental issue. So we see it as a human rights issue. We see marginalized communities, obviously, that are disproportionately impacted in a myriad of ways. As the world is transitioning to green energy, it's also important to talk about social justice, about systematic racism issues. Really important to create equitable livelihoods for people who are even moving out of oil and gas businesses, people who are directly and indirectly impacted by climate change. And then finally, I would say impact investing in general is on the rise. We're always looking for, this triple bottom line. So it wouldn't be an ESG discussion if we didn't talk about that. ESG really shot up the agenda on the back of the pandemic. Research shows that 1 in 5 investors now intend to double their investments in the space over the next 5 years. So just creating that, the win-win situation for all elements of the sustainability paradigm shift and sustainability, if you will. So I'll hold it there, but happy to chime in anytime.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Misha. And that's really fascinating, particularly about South Korea. And Mark, you're currently living in Italy, I believe, and probably have seen some of these trends that Misha's talking about. For one thing, we know that the European Union amended its non-financial disclosure requirements in 2021 to strengthen foundations for sustainable investment, kind of what you were speaking to, Misha, as well. And the world's leading reporting frameworks have also outlined a shared vision for comprehensive corporate reporting that includes both financial accounting and sustainability disclosure. So Mark, I'd love to hear if you've seen this trend in Europe, particularly the trend toward mandating ESG reporting, improve or not improve relations between corporations and the communities in which they work.
Thanks, Christina. So I, to be honest, I don't know. I recently moved to Europe, so I'm not a Europe ESG expert. But I'm curious to hear what Misha and Lauren think. I think one is when people talk about ESG, sometimes the standards, there's all these different metrics that different companies are using. Some of them say they're doing great, and if you measure them against different set of standards. They're not doing as great as they are. And so I think coming up with a standard that touches as many companies, you're able to then compare apples to apples, which has been I would say a big problem in the past with ESG. So I think it helps a lot that Europe is trying to create this more standard approaches to measuring this. I think one of the things, and I spent more of my time in the US than I have in Europe thus far, is the political piece. I think a lot of us as consumers in the US, there's a lot more money in politics that often doesn't get captured into ESG. So if you're talking about climate change or COVID, as Misha's mentioned, there's sometimes it's hard to escape political, structural, systemic change without looking at money in politics, especially in the US. I can't speak for South Korea or some of these other countries, but it cost about $1 billion to run a campaign to become president of the United States. And a lot of that money comes from people, from companies, their PACs, or people who are employees who have to disclose who their employer is. And sometimes these interests can affect their giving. So we're a big fan of ESGP, of the political giving, because sometimes the P doesn't get captured into the social side, or may not get covered in the governance side, because oftentimes that's internal. But almost every major company gives to some policymaker at the state, local, state, or federal level in the US, abortion, climate change, anything really. And so we think that that is a big missing, whether Europe or the US, it's a big missing variable that most consumers take into consideration when they look at ESG ratings, that most of them miss it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark. I think what you're also really speaking to, and I love the adding the P to ESG, but I think what you're really speaking to is this disconnect between capital and community, which I know is at the heart of some of the issues that really prevent corporations from truly embedding meaningful social impact goals into the core of their corporate strategy. So Lauren, I'd love to turn to you, because I know that that's something that you talk a lot about. And I'd love if you could share a little bit about your thoughts on this disconnect, and then what mission-driven finance is doing to address this disconnect.
Thanks, Christina. You're right that there is a disconnect between capital and community. There is a lot of very technical jargon. Mark referenced it, with so many different criteria in ESG metrics that's even just one extra layer on top of how finance operates. There are many, many, many different terms that need to be understood to be able to translate them to communities. And finance, and particularly capital that seeks to be growing and accumulating, is often not concerned with these things that have been considered externalities, like who's going to be impacted by this work? What is the, what kind of outflows from a manufacturing facility, where's that going to be borne out? And so we consider ESG and impact investing as a way to internalize those externalities, instead of having that be a price that's paid by somebody else, that is part of how a corporation actually thinks. What we do at Mission Driven Finance is we help to design, develop, and manage impact capital vehicles, primarily supporting private companies, nonprofit and for-profit, but helping to create these vehicles that help capital to flow into community and be in deep relationship. Sometimes we work with corporate capital allocators as they are trying to make a commitment to better support the communities they're operating in, and they want to have partners that can help them to reconnect and build those relationships. But oftentimes it's working with Christina's former organization and things like that to design a capital vehicle that can help accelerate a mission. So these are, the way that I unpack it is to really consider breaking down an investment thesis into 4 key parts and saying, if we invest X kind of capital and Q kind of support into Y initiatives, then we expect Z impact and financial returns. And really it's getting at the heart of what is that impact return that you want to have? who are those why initiatives that you want to be in relationship with, and starting the conversation there instead of focusing precisely and exclusively on what kind of financial return am I making. When we incorporate those pieces back together, then we can have really robust relationships between corporations with capital and their communities. So it's what I like to do. I'm also going to leave an article in the chat that just came out last week from the Stanford Social Innovation Review about ESG and impact investing.
Oh, thank you so much, Lauren. And Misha, I feel like you might have a lot to say on this too. Love to hear why you think maybe some companies are doing a better job than others of working with communities to address their own ESG goals.
Yeah, that's a great question. I get a lot. So typically when I work with companies, they really focus on reducing their environmental footprint. We're starting to see more and more focus on social responsibility, diversity, equity, and inclusion as well. So I've seen a number of companies like Unilever's, Ben & Jerry's, focusing on human rights, social and economic justice. We've seen social enterprises like Homeboy Industries providing job training positions, social services, formerly incarcerated men and women. We are seeing companies like Warby Parker perfecting the buy a pair, give a pair model. When Tom's Shoes first came out with the 1-for-1 model, it was a good foundation that a lot of companies built on and expanded on. And I think one of the reasons companies are doing well is because they look at their impact on those communities. As Lauren was alluding to, what are you doing beyond the organization? How are you empowering communities outside of your organization? So Warby Parker, in essence, was able to address the issue of a lot of people in the world not having access to vision. So they do it through two ways. They empower people in developing countries to administer basic eye exams and provide their glasses at affordable pricing. I promise I'm not a shareholder, but I really love their model. And then the second model is really through social entrepreneur. So that's more the social entrepreneurship. They empower local entrepreneurs to sell those items rather than giving them away. So teaching someone how to fish. They also have partnerships in place where they directly give vision care and glasses to those in need, and they do that through cross-sector partnerships. They have a specific pupils project that they've launched in 70 US school districts. So that example really shows that these public-private partnerships are key to engaging communities. And I think that's the first step that a lot of organizations need to take if they want to be part of that ESG conversation and include communities, specifically because we don't all need to reinvent the wheel. We're not asking every organization to have a nonprofit arm. We're not asking every organization to be a B Corp. What we are asking is to make sure that you look at the communities you touch and maximize your impact. Obviously, one of the other examples that's gotten a lot of buzz lately is Patagonia. So what more can you do for planet and communities than making Earth your only shareholder? So although, again, that's one of the very exceptional examples, we're not holding all organizations to that standard, but showing that you can be both radically responsible, very profitable. There's a lot of obviously controversy around these, very radical decisions, and we can talk about that offline. But it's definitely not a one and done mentality. So addressing equity is something that is an ongoing process. It's an evergreen role we play. And obviously just being able as an organization to strive and work towards a more sustainable, equitable, and just world, it's no small feat. So I applaud a lot of companies who are doing important work in this space and partnering up with the right organizations to do so.
Thank you, Misha.
Quickly.
Yeah, please.
That last piece, Misha, is so key, is building a partnership. And so often companies should focus on growing the business, which is no easy feat in and of itself, but having partnerships with folks that have relationships in community is one of the best ways so that you don't have unintended consequences. I know there with some of the buy one, give one, they had unintended consequences of market distortion when they flooded, don't remember which companies these were, but they flooded some communities with free items, that can make it hard for those that were operating and running a business to be able to have that income. And so working with the people on the ground in the communities that you're seeking to support and saying, what do you need? And centering their perspectives is, I think, one of the key pieces for companies to really be in right relationship.
Thank you, Lauren. And I actually want to turn it back to you to hear maybe an example, because I got to see firsthand how important it was to work with you with my last organization, actually set up a financial tool through really engaging the people who were going to be most directly impacted. So really taking a human-centered design approach. And I'd love to hear an example, another example, perhaps, of the work that Mission Driven Finance is doing to really center the community, because I think that's a really good model that corporations should be working to more directly, is like, how do you really center those who are impacted and not just brand themselves as doing something good for the environment or for society.
Thanks for the question. The work that we did with the Freedom 100 Fund is definitely a fascinating microcosm, but more often I'm working with partners that are running like an accelerator. I have 4 or 5 of those partners at the moment, and they have been, again, they have the relationships in community. I cannot scale all the relationships I have. I know my hometown, current home base of San Diego, California well. I know where I grew up in Honolulu very well. I can't get to know every community. I cannot build all of the relationships. So again, partnering with folks that do have the relationship and helping to equip them with the tools to build these impact capital funds. Like I said, I've got a handful of partners who are accelerators. They're running programs and are training and supporting entrepreneurs, small businesses, and they're often still not qualifying for traditional sources of capital. They may have gone above and beyond what they can put on a credit card. They may not have access to friends and family networks that can provide them early capital, but they can't certainly make it to bank financing. It's very challenging to get all the way up to what banks are looking for, especially in our current economic environment. So we help to design these funds, and we say, what is it with the community that you serve, those that are going through your accelerator programs, what do they need? Why are they not qualifying? What are their specific parameters around their business growth, around their impact, around their visions? So I'm working with 2 that are specifically supporting Indigenous entrepreneurs, and they tell me exactly, here are 5 case studies of businesses that we work with, and here's why they were declined. Here's the kind of capital they need. And we say, okay, start with what they need, build around that and what kind of capital is affordable and accessible to them. And then we put that in place and then have conversations with investors. And we got a question about, how do you set that rate? I set it first at, what does the community need? And then have conversations with investors of, in order to create the impact that we're talking about, this is why we need to have capital of this type, this kind of flexibility and timeline, this kind of rate and affordability, and these kinds of covenants that allow for the flexibility to meet the businesses where they're at. So that's a very high level of how we put these together. And the way that it showed up with Freedom for Immigrants was, there's only so much that these bonds can repay. Anybody who's gotten into immigration detention, we cannot unpack all of that in today's conversation, but there is revenue from repaying bonds as immigrants go to all of their court hearings. And then that is not a very large amount. So we could not afford to have, say, a 25% return for investor capital. We could say, in order to really support the release of 100 immigrants, we need to have a low rate of return and philanthropic support for a reserve for any times that these don't go according to plan. And making that case of saying, to achieve this impact, this is what we need. That is, again, centering what does the community need and why is it that this set of parameters for how we design the finance, why that's in place.
Thank you, Lauren. And I think what you brought up about these like barriers to entry, so barriers to accessing capital, particularly for folks on the margin, is not only just a financial issue. I think it is a political issue. And so that, of course, makes me think of you, Mark, and the work that you're doing with Progressive Shopper to gather data on how corporate political influence intersects with ESG. Particularly as a mechanism for corporations to support legislation and policymakers who can institute or inhibit bills that advance or impede any particular social issue, including, particularly ESG mechanisms as well. So I'd love if you could share a little bit more about this landscape. You started to talk about it, but I think it's fascinating.
Sure. I think, we start sort of where Misha and Lauren said, like partnerships are critical to this. And I think the way we think about it is like companies can do four things. Usually when some social issue happens, the easiest is that they give money through their philanthropy. Let's just take two issues, gender or race. They can give to Planned Parenthood, let's say for women's health and reproductive rights, or they can give to the NAACP, Color of Change, let's say for racial justice. The other classical one, like we saw a lot after George Floyd's murder, is their PR, their comms, their marketing. Usually big teams, usually big budgets, and they change their avatars. They put up their statements that Black Lives Matter, that they are in solidarity, in community with these partner organizations to try to elevate. And then you sort of look a little bit deeper, and that's like their HR policies. So how many women are on their C-suite? How many women are on their board? Are they at parity with what the US population is, which is 51%? Or all the women in junior roles, or people of color, or women of color in junior roles, which is a very classic way that large institutions sort of juice their numbers by saying that they've got more or they're at parity, but it's all at non-senior levels. And then you sort of look at, let's say, more nuance, like a reproductive rights. Are they providing personal time off for their female employees? As we know, lots of states have made getting reproductive health hard. So some companies are allowing, subsidizing, not penalizing for time off or travel to go if they need to other states. That's when you start getting more nuance. When they give Planned Parenthood money, when they put out a statement that women's health matters, but they don't provide PTO, but they make it harder for their female employees, or same thing with racial justice. That's sort of where you see this whitewashing, greenwashing, pinkwashing, there's all these colors of this inconsistent ESG. And then again, I would argue, maybe I've drunk the juice too long, in government is their political giving. So any ESG issue, government is affecting the lives of 330 million, if not, look at foreign policy, 8 billion now live on this earth. And so it's weird if you say you care about racial justice, but you're donating money to Rand Paul, who doesn't think lynching is a hate crime. Or if you say you care about lowering your carbon footprints, you put out statements on about climate change or our Earth Day, but then you give to Ted Cruz, who doesn't think that climate change exists. And that's sort of where I think investors and customers are saying it's weird. A really good example is LGBTQ, so Human Rights Campaign, phenomenal LGBTQ organization. They have this really well-known index called the Corporate Equality Index, where they grade how companies treat LGBTQ employees. Are they hiring them, promoting them, gender neutral bathrooms, so on and so forth. And they'll give 0 to 100. And so they also score how policymakers vote on LGBTQ issues. Weird thing is they'll give AT&T, true fact, 100% on their Corporate Equality Index, but AT&T then gave money to Ted Cruz that doesn't believe in gay marriage, doesn't believe that transgender members should serve in the military, or Steve King, thankfully out of office, who held similar things. So it's weird that you're putting on your website all the rainbow avatars, you're saying you've got a 100% score on Corporate Equality Index, and yet you're giving loads of money to policymakers that are making it pretty hard for LGBTQ people to be treated like anyone else. And that's where I think ESG is missing. some of that, or impact investing, lots of these other CSR, there's all these acronyms or phrases. We fail to look at the systems change aspect of the political giving that you're never going to, all this other stuff doesn't reach scale if you're not aligning your political giving with all the impact investing, ESG, CSR.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I think, this disconnect is really why 3/4 of consumers just in the United States alone believe it's becoming harder to trust what companies say and do. There's this clear disconnect. Thank you so much, Mark. So before turning it over to the audience, I'd love to ask each of you a final question. But to the audience, I see that there's already a lot of questions coming in on the chat, and encourage you to share if you have any other questions there. You can direct it to everyone. You can direct it directly just to me if you're shy, but definitely want to get those questions in there. Okay, so Misha, I'm so glad that you're able to jump back on. It's always a little nerve-wracking when we're dealing with Zoom for these panels, but we're glad to have you back. So I was just gonna turn it over to each one of you. We have a lot of graduate students, even undergraduate students, potentially even high school students on today's Zoom meeting, webinar. And so I'd love if you could share one piece of advice that you give to organizational leaders who find it challenging to implement ESG in their business operations. And I think this is a good question for starting social entrepreneurs to even be thinking about, or folks who are hoping to one day be a leader of an organization. So I'd love to, if it's all right, start with you, Misha, on this one.
Yes, thank you so much. That's a great question. So working on issues like climate change and social justice can be tough. It's really easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis, the feeling of defeat by unexpected setbacks. So it can be frustrating. So I always talk about this concept of ecological grief or eco grief, just holding that space. And understanding that we're dealing with a lot of very global issues that, traditionally governments and other organizations haven't been able to solve. So how can we leverage business as a force for good and feel that we can be part of the change, because the change starts with all of us. I hear a lot of times from organizations that they feel like their impact wouldn't be as, exponential or as big as they'd like it to be. So I always start with the, end in mind and look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So where would we like to be in 2030? What is the blueprint? What are these 17 specific goals we're working on? And find out what it is your organization is actively working on. What is your organization's strategy? How can you incorporate this as part of your DNA? Tie it to your business operations. Again, make sure it's a win-win-win situation. So hopefully organizations and leaders like yourselves in the audience can look at sustainability not as a side issue to be managed in a committee, but rather a major issue, a larger issue that the entire executive team C-suite can work on. So not just looking at ESG and sustainability as a bolt-on approach. That would really be overall holistically my recommendation, and obviously looking at best practices, looking at what other organizations are doing. Public-private partnerships are so key. Knowing that focusing and investing in ESG makes you more attractive to investors. You can drive change. There are amazing programs out there, as we've heard from Lauren, just these community programs and helping, aspiring entrepreneurs, as well as Mark, just the work they're doing. There's so many bright individuals in the space who are working on making this education and this entrepreneurship accessible. Obviously, USC is a big part of that paradigm shift and that education. So making sure you really connect ESG to your organization's core strategy, and knowing that change starts with you.
Christina, I think you're on mute.
I am, but love to hear Lauren or Mark if you have thoughts on that advice as well. Thank you, Misha.
I think Misha said it so well with that win-win-win piece is, and I saw a question that came in of how can you ensure that where there are sticking points, whether that's with the municipalities or organizations that haven't been in relationship, I use my friend Lehman's advice of remember that everybody is dialed in to the same radio station, WIIFM, what's in it for me? And joking a little bit, but how can you tie your goals to what they are trying to achieve so that this doesn't feel like it's counter to what another party is looking for, whether that's a potential employer, a partner, anybody that you are seeking to work with? How can you frame what you're seeking to do in terms of what are their things that they're trying to get across? For politicians, they definitely are trying to get reelected. They're trying to get certain policy through. That you can talk to them about how your position, whether that's as an employee or as a business leader, how that can align with their mission. So I always look for those opportunities to say, how can I not say exactly what I want to tell you, but what do you need to hear so that these can be integrated? But Misha lifted up, there are so many beautiful bright spots. I shared with a co-panelist that this morning I had breakfast with the other San Diego B corporations. There's about 25 in San Diego, which is a growing number, but there are such cool businesses and great opportunities that you can be inspired by, learn from, see how many different ways there are to put your business practices to use as a force for good.
That's great, Lauren.
I agree with Misha and Lauren. I think part of what we're trying to do with progressive shoppers, look at the data. More and more companies are making value statements. So it's not just, the classic, like make as much profit. So you'll see often for heritage months or other anniversaries, they'll speak in solidarity with various principles or values. And I think our big thing is, are you being intentional about it? So again, it's super easy to put out a tweet or an Instagram post that you support women, but if you've got none on the C-suite or the board, like how meaningful are you? And so I think if you don't have to pick all the sustainability goals, but if you pick one or some, just go through and say, are we being intentional? Are we meaningfully advancing this internally and externally? Because I think as the data becomes easier for people to get and see, whether regulation or there's just so much more data that is put out there than ever before, consumers, especially younger ones, are going to be asking for it and calling out when companies don't align. Like we've seen Adidas with Kanye West, like there's just KFC had an AI bot do something weird on the anniversary of the start of the Holocaust. Like there's this stuff just gets plastered everywhere. All the journalists are always looking for it. And so I think for companies or individuals, it's pick one or two issues, and then whether yourself, but is the company that you're joining or wanting to start, are you being comprehensive in advancing it?
That's great. Thank you, Mark. So I have some questions from the audience, and I have a question first for Lauren from Mark Spears, who's been a friend of the lab and supporter of the lab for a long time. So Mark asks, given the perception is that impact investing is willing to accept lower returns for intangible, quote, good, what is mission-driven finance experience on impact investing ROI? And is there any momentum behind valuing historically intangible outcomes along with traditional return considerations?
I love this question. There's so much that's packed in here. Couple of pieces is one, intangible good that we are getting better as a field in measuring. I am really fortunate to be in a cohort with fantastic other colleagues elevating the practice of impact measurement and management. These are allocators, development finance institutions, and intermediaries like mission-driven finance. And the practice of impact measurement and management is leaps and bounds from where it was even 10 years ago. So I think we're getting better at being able to quantify and qualify what that intangible good does look like. And to the point around historically overlooked communities and really clarifying that, I definitely talk about this using economic terms, that we can be intertemporal savings and consumption choices, to really sound nerdy. But if we can invest now in challenges that we're presented with, that can reduce the need for spending in the future. So while it may be, taking a short-term perspective on your performance of a specific investment, might seem like this is not going to be returning everything I need to me. When you look at it holistically in a portfolio of many different types of asset classes, you could see that investing in, say, the Freedom 100 fund, which I can talk about since it's no longer accepting capital, that is not going to be what you should put your kids' college tuition in. But if you believe in the abolition of an immigration detention system that is inhumane and profit motivated and sucking out our tax dollars, you might say that this is actually a good thing to invest in because it will reduce my societal tax burden down the line. So I try to make this bigger picture case rather than saying, just look at this one investment. Think about it from your portfolio and the global portfolio of all investors and how capital is moving. Yes, it's going to be a lower return than an extractive investment in, say, building a new strip mall, but what does that look like holistically for society?
Thanks, Lauren. That's such a great answer. I have another question here from one of our students here, Latrice Berry, who wants to know, what are the learnings for companies who are looking to better incorporate equity as an ESG pillar? And I know all three of you have actually spoken to that, but I'll maybe turn it to you, Misha, first. So again, the question is, what are the learnings for companies who are looking to better incorporate equity as an ESG pillar? And open it up to all of you too.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's, really central focus of this conversation. When we look at this question, I think the first thing we need to understand is what not to do. As someone who works in the digital marketing space as well, I've seen a lot of companies deal with, PR and crisis management because they weren't putting DEI front and center. So I think it's really important to start with that. How do we want to be more inclusive in our hiring practices? How do we want to commit to DEI? How do we organize our company in such a way that there are safe spaces, psychologically safe outlets for employees to voice concerns? I think it starts with the organization, the equity within the organization in and of itself. And then I think it really starts with looking at the communities you're serving and understanding that even, in our own backyard in LA, we have so many marginalized communities, understanding how you can connect your business to that, to ultimately connect ESG to your core strategy. You don't want to be a company that's, for example, in packaged goods and then invest in a nonprofit or, give back funds to an organization that's absolutely not tied to your mission or your expertise. So I do think aligning those things is really, really key. I think it also goes beyond internal outward-facing spokespeople. We've seen a lot of crises occur because companies decided to partner up with influencers or celebrities who've done a lot of controversial things. So I think it's really important to have a spokesperson that represents your brand well, that is very aligned with your company values. So it's not a one and done quick fix answer. I think it really starts with the organization ground up, looking at HR, looking at your commitments, looking at the people who represent your company, and then looking at the communities, and then be receptive to feedback, making sure you incorporate that. We're all human. We all are doing our best to, run operations as smooth as possible and be, do good while being, doing well. But it's an ever dynamic process. So understanding that there are some failures that may occur in the process as well. I'll hand it over to my colleagues who will be much more eloquent in expressing their responses to this.
Lauren, do you want to? Oh, go ahead.
Sure. I just dropped in the chat. B Corp, B Lab is the certifying nonprofit. They ran an inclusive economy challenge. And while there is more work to be done in ensuring that these are the best metrics, they're revamping their certification process. This is a great starting point to even see how can companies consider doing things differently, even as an existing certified benefit or B corporation, excuse me. We took on the challenge and said, here are things that we can do differently so that we can continue to be learning more, doing better in our own practices as an employer, as folks that we contract and use vendors, vendor selection. Where can we vote with our dollars and show these practices that we value them literally with our purchasing power? So I love this as a starting point. It's not the end point, but for those that are wondering how to get started, it's a good place.
I agree with everything again. I think my 2 cents, entertainment industry is rife with sexism, racism, ableism, probably other isms. Harvey Weinstein, like classic, like huge issues with the entertainment system not having sexual harassment and similar policies. We talk about like mitigating risk. It's like how hard it was when these issues come up for people to seek recourse. Obviously, Time's Up has been like a prominent way to get the philanthropic dollars. There's been a little bit on the getting more women into C-suite, getting women onto boards as an example. So I think some of this stuff is like, people are very intense on looking at how much profit or what their loss or what franchise to open or whatnot. They don't look at like sort of the mitigating risk, like if do we have enough women, people of color, women of color on these boards? How do we make sure that who's not at the table is at the table? So if issues come up, and ideally things go better because there's a wider audience than just white guys that are in a lot of decision-making roles in the entertainment industry in particular, that they're going, it's not only about risk mitigation, but it's also about expanding profit and impact. I love the B Corp and B Lab. I think they're echoing green. Some of them were echoing green fellows, Christina, Andrew Tarsi, I think. And I think like it's great at getting that standard. I think we, at least in Progressive Shopper, we're trying to deal with where we want to get to. But like the Fortune 1000, I think very few, if any, are B Corps. And if you look at how much dollars we all spend, like if you start today, this morning, and you look in a week's time from your bank account or your wallet, how many of your dollars go to B Corp versus non-B Corp, I suspect then non-B Corp is a lot bigger. I know some companies, Danone, Laureate Education, have gone into becoming B Corp. But I still think there's a huge opportunity to pressure the non-B Corp, these large, big box stores, big box names, to fix their issues, get in line with some of these B Corp things. So we're not just sort of giving them a pass and investing our time and money into B Corps to try to scale them so that they are household names. So I want to make sure we like push on both of those. I don't know if Lauren, if you disagree, because you mentioned the B Corp thing, but I worry that like these large companies, Nike, Adidas, get away with some of this stuff because they put certain celebrities that they say like blanking on names, but they'll like align themselves with people that are doing good, but not necessarily ensuring their carbon footprint is as low as it could be, or other basic policies because they do the splashy thing, right?
I don't disagree. I think we need all the tools in the toolbox. As I don't really joke, the world is on fire, y'all. We have a lot of challenges that are at hand, and we need to be working on the very intentional impact first companies and scaling them up. And we need to be working on the larger corporations, pension plans, all sorts of big movers of capital to ensure that they are making changes to be better because they're having an outsized impact. Everybody has an impact. It's whether you're intentional about it or not. So I do believe that we need both for the top down, bottom up, all over the place.
Definitely. And I love this next question because it's definitely on point to the pressure that needs to be put on to some of these corporations. And this is a question directed to you, Mark, but love to hear from anyone. The question is, although many companies say they prioritize ESG practices, and I think you brought this up too, Mark, it can be difficult to verify that their claims are accurate. And that goes to the point you were making as well, Misha, around greenwashing. But how do consumers or communities put pressure on companies to be more transparent?
I think there's variety of different things. There's like a law it's being challenged on California where they have to put, I believe, at least one woman on a board if they're incorporated in California. So there's laws, there's MSCI, SASB, there's all these like lettered entities that people disclose, CDP, where they disclose their various social impact or ESG related things. As you mentioned, Christina, Europe, again, that's on the regulation side of things. And companies have SEC filings. So that's another way that companies have to be more transparent on this. It's not enough, which is why there's like always movements to get more transparency, better data, standardize that data. And so, yeah, we're not there yet. We often, as Progressive Shopper, we look to nonprofits, think tanks, academic institutions that track this stuff. So I mentioned Human Rights Campaign, for example. Rainforest Action Network looks at insurance companies that insure coal factories. So there's great organizations out there. We try to track all the ones that we're aware of on Progressive Shopper, where we try to partner with them to get the data. How much paid family leave? There's another great group called Plus that looks at that data. So different entities have the data. They usually ask the companies to disclose. If they don't, they try to force them to disclose. They try to get some of the, like we're seeing with Russia, invasion of Ukraine. There's a coalition that shows, look, all these companies have done Mondelez, which sells Oreos, for example. They're claiming that their candy products are vital to the Russian market, which is ridiculous. And so we're trying to pressure Mondelez to leave Russia to ensure their revenues aren't going anywhere to the Russian government. So I think that's a big thing. There's one question I want to say, like some of this stuff is option, like you can go above and beyond. There's some stuff like climate change, as Lauren said, the world's on fire. It's Howard Zinn, a historian that I like a lot, said you can't be neutral on a moving train. We just had midterm elections. Lots of companies have opted into providing paid leave for their employees to go and vote because some folks couldn't do it. Different states or just time couldn't be able to vote, and they vote on Tuesday, but they don't want to be penalized. So there's a lot, especially lower income people, can't take the time off to go and vote. So there's been a growing coalition of companies that say, hey, like, don't worry about it. You're not going to get docked pay if you go and vote on election day. So that's stuff like you either participate or you don't. It's hard to talk about enhancing voter participation if you stay quiet on this stuff. You can't stay quiet on climate change, transgender rights, LGBTQ, abortion rights. There's all this stuff that's happening. It's almost impossible for companies to sort of stand back, because if they stand back or stay silent, they're basically being complicit in their silence in a lot of these issues.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. And I think Chad, too, in our audience brings up a good point. I love what you said, Mark, about not being politically neutral. And Chad actually asked, is it possible for ESG to be politically neutral? He talks about how you made such a good point with corporate donations to politicians who are obstacles. But he also says, however, in a practical world, businesses must work with regulators of all parties to function. And I think therein lies some of the rub here. So I don't know if anyone has a final thought here on this before we close.
I think there's a way that business can say, we want to operate and make sure employees are not being discriminated for who they are. Famous bills like in Indiana, North Carolina, they had anti-transgender bathroom legislation. So Salesforce, a lot of other companies said, if this bill passes, we're leaving. And they're doing it in a way of saying, look, we are an equal opportunity employer. That's the law. We want to buy that. We want to make sure that the best talent in your states participate in this. This is against our values and our basic practices. So we're not, I think some of them are more vocal and saying they do support LGBTQ rights, but some of them are like, hey, this is some basic stuff from an employment point of view. If this bill passes, we're pulling out or we're not expanding in your state. And I think that's been a very helpful way, is the bottom line for tax revenue for a lot of these state level policymakers comes into conflict when they start taking these cultural, social issues, because companies, thankfully, in some cases, not all, push back and say we can't operate if you're going to start discriminating against people.
Thanks, Mark. Lauren or Misha, any final thoughts on this or anything else you want to add before we conclude?
Yes, these are great points by Mark. I just wanted to add a very simple concept that was asked earlier on. So what can consumers do? I've worked with a number of clients, multi-million-dollar companies that would have Facebook groups and other public outlets. And I cannot tell you how impactful it was to have a vocal group of consumers ask very direct questions about their packaging, voice their concerns. So going back to Lauren's point earlier, voting with your dollar, but also knowing that your voice matters and these companies are listening. Negative word of mouth is much stickier than positive word of mouth. So I can tell you from personal experience that these companies are definitely listening, tuning in. It's not just a vocal minority that speaks up. Once a group of people start, basically discrediting your packaging, questioning your politics, posting on LinkedIn, posting on Instagram, leaving negative reviews. These are all places where we can say, where we don't align with your values. I've had customers who would, just say, I won't purchase from this company until they fix, XYZ supply chain issue, whatever it may be. So I think there's a lot of power to just, leveraging social media, voicing these concerns and knowing that executive teams at the end of the day, they're listening. It's public, we're in a digital space. So it seems very simple, but your impact is much more, all our impacts are much more than we may realize.
You two said it better than I could. Just there are many different ways to address these challenges. You can use your dollars, you can use your voice, you can use your voice to be a squeaky wheel, and you can use your voice to amplify where you want more data and transparency as well. When there's just isn't information to know if they're doing it right or wrong, the lifting up your voice to push on that is key so that we can hold people accountable.
Amazing. Thank you all so much. So great to see so many of you in the audience, and so grateful to all the panelists here for watching. I will just say the next panel discussion in this series will be in the new year on January 31st, also at noon California time. And the topic will be something that's very, very dear to my heart. It will be on community economics, a path toward decarceration. So we hope to see you all there, and thank you all. Thank you to our panelists. Bye-bye.
Thank you.